Welcome back. Now that we have a basic grasp on Unreal Engine materials, it's time to put together the material that was made for the drone asset. Before we do that, we're going to take a look at that brick clay new material just one more time because I want to show you how easy it is to apply materials to instances of meshes in the world. We saw that we could select our sphere and change its material here, but there's an easier way. You can actually find a material in the content drawer, such as going to starter content, going to materials, and finding a material. And you can click and drag a material directly onto a static mesh in the scene. And that's going to apply the material to that static mesh. We'll see in materials in the details panel, that material has now been changed to the material that we dragged in. So if you were curious what all of these complex nodes in the material graph for this brick clay new material looks like, well, not only can you see that on the preview in the viewport, in the material editor, you can also see it on a mesh in the world. And that goes for any mesh in the world. You can click and drag a material onto that mesh and change its material. Now, not all materials are going to look appropriate on all meshes. As you can see that this material here looks a little strange on a cube because it has these sharp edges and it doesn't really look realistic, but it can look pretty good on something like a floor. If you click and drag a material onto the floor, you can see that, well, this one looks pretty decent. We still have the grid on the floor, but we've seen that we can click show and uncheck grid and get rid of that grid to see that floor without the grid on there, and it looks relatively like a brick floor. I'm going to Control Z to undo that, and now that we understand how to apply materials in a couple of different ways, let's work on our drone material. Now, oftentimes when you get assets from an asset pack, such as meshes that come with materials, you may obtain those assets from somewhere on the internet, and they may not contain an Unreal Engine material. That Unreal Engine material asset has to be constructed with nodes here in the engine from the textures that were generated for that asset. So in a realistic game development setting, this will often be the case where you're given an FBX for the mesh and a set of textures for the material. And you have to have a basic understanding of Unreal Engine materials so that you can construct that material asset and apply it. That's what we're going to do now. So I want to find the folder where my drone is located in the content folder. To do that, I can right-click on the drone in the world and browse to the asset, and it's here in content/drone. And here's my drone material. I'd like to get those textures into my project. And by those textures, I'm referring to these .tga files that I've provided with you for the course. We'd like to get these in. Now, we've seen how to import assets through the import button. We've seen how to import assets by right-clicking in the content drawer and selecting import to. A third option is to drag them in. So I'm going to select all four of these textures, click, and drag them in. Now, as soon as that happens, now my content drawer has these four texture assets. And if I click Save All and make sure to save these by clicking Save Selected, now those asterisks go away. And if I select one of them, right-click and Show in Explorer, now I have U assets for these textures automatically generated by the engine in content/drone. So these are different than those .tgas. These are the actual U assets. And those U assets are the reason why we can double-click on them to look at them. Pretty nice. Now I'm going to close some of these tabs. I can do that by clicking on the X. If you didn't know, you could also hit the middle mouse button, that scroll wheel, on a tab to close it. And you can also right-click on one of the tabs and close all tabs to the right. If you have a whole bunch of tabs open, you can click Close Tabs to the Right, and everything to the right of that tab will be closed. Just a little handy shortcut for you. But let's take a look at the four textures we have. Notice they're all prefixed with T. T stands for texture, and these are texture assets. Let's open tDrone_BC. I'm going to double click it, and BC stands for base color. This is a texture designed to be hooked up to the base color input in a result node in a material. So this is what the base color looks like, just laid out on a flat surface, but it's designed to be applied to the specific mesh it was made for, that drone mesh. So we're going to change our drone material now. I'm going to go ahead and click and drag to highlight these 4 nodes and hit delete to remove them. And in fact, I don't need base color anymore. I'm no longer going to use a 4-dimensional vector, which is just a flat color. I'm going to delete that as well. And I'm going to create a texture sample. Now, we've seen that we can drag a texture into the material graph to generate a texture sample node. We can also right-click in the material graph and type texture and select texture sample to get a texture sample node. Notice that its texture property was automatically populated with tDroneBC. How did the engine know to do that? Well, that's because I had tDroneBC selected in the content drawer. So the engine often uses whatever you have selected to populate things that it thinks you want populated when you create nodes. So now that we have a texture sample, we can drag its RGB, the topmost pin, into base color. And now we see what this texture looks like applied to a sphere. But as I mentioned, this texture is not designed to be applied to a sphere. It's designed specifically to be applied to our drone mesh. So this is one of those cases where I would want to customize the preview mesh with this rightmost icon. To do that, I have to go to the content drawer, select my static mesh drone asset, and click the rightmost icon to change the preview mesh to our drone. Now we can see what this texture looks like applied to our drone mesh. This is what it's supposed to look like, at least the base color. Now, yes, it looks flat because we haven't plugged anything into the other input pins on the result node. This is just color information and nothing else. But base color isn't the only texture we have. We have others, right? We have EM, NRM, and ORM, and we'll talk about what those mean. We'll start with NRM. This is the normal map. It's NRM, and we saw that the normal map for that clay brick texture we checked out in the last video had N at the end of the name. So you can see that different artists use different naming conventions, and we'll talk more about asset naming conventions soon in this course. But for now, let's take a look at this normal map. We can double click it, and this is what it looks like. This is the normal map for our drone. We're going to drag this in to our M drone material. Now, I don't have to have my drone material editor open to get this normal map in. I can actually click and drag it on up to the tab. As soon as I hover over that tab, we will open that material editor, and I can release, and now I have a texture sample with its texture set to this normal map. And I can drag that RGB value into normal, and now we have the normal map applied. And the little cracks and crevices look like they're applied on the geometry itself, but that's really the illusion created from the normal map. Pretty cool. Now we have 2 more textures. EM, that stands for emissive, and ORM, that stands for occlusion roughness metallic. We'll start with EM. I'm going to drag that one in and get a texture sample. And this one is designed for emissive color. So I'm going to move these nodes around to make some room. And I'm going to drag that RGB value into emissive color. And now we see some glowing on certain parts of the mesh, not the whole mesh. And that's because our texture sample is mostly black, except for a few specific areas on that texture. And we can double click that texture to see that there isn't a whole lot. There's just some red on certain parts of the texture. Everything else is black. And where there's black, the emissive color is going to ignore that. And where there's color, we're going to get a glow effect. And you can really see it in the shadows where it's glowing there. So that's a nice additional effect. Now we have one more texture, this ORM. Let's drag that one in and get a texture sample. And we'll make some room by dragging these nodes off to the left and dragging this one down. And here we have a new texture sample. Now I want to double click on this one and open it up, and notice that It looks a little funny, right? There's a lot of colors here. Well, this is a packed texture. You see, this texture is designed to be used for multiple pins here on the result node. It's designed to be used for ambient occlusion, it's designed to be used for roughness, and it's designed to be used for metallic. Now, these three inputs expect grayscale values. For every pixel, there should be a value of 0, which is black, or 1, which is white, or some value in between, which is some shade of gray. And grayscale images can be packed into a single texture because textures have red, green, and blue channels. Now here in the texture editor, we can isolate the red, green, and blue channels by clicking and unclicking on these three icons here. I've deselected green and blue, and now I can see only the red channel of this texture. So this is color information in the red channel for this texture. And that's what we're going to use for occlusion. That's the O in the ORM here. Occlusion, or in other words, ambient occlusion. If we hover over ambient occlusion, the pop-up says, simulate the self-shadowing that happens within crevices of a surface or of a volume for volumetric clouds only. This is going to simulate shadows in crevices of a mesh. It's not really shadows, it's simulating shadows based on crevices in the geometry. That's the red channel in this packed texture. That's what we're going to plug in. We're going to take the red, the R pin, and hook that up to ambient occlusion. And that gives us a little bit more dimensionality to the texture. And we can really see this if we disconnect the other wires that are hooked up to the result node. Now we can do that by holding Alt and left-clicking on a given input pin to disconnect that wire. We're going to do that for all three of these. Now, because our base color has nothing hooked into it, we can't really see much, but we could take that red channel and hook it up to base color and see that this is what it would look like if we use that red channel, that grayscale information, as the base color. We see that it's darker in the cracks and whiter on the surfaces. That's the information in that red channel. Now, you may be confused, why isn't it red? Well, the red channel itself is just grayscale. Same goes for green and blue. It's only when the red, green, and blue channels are combined into a color that we have color information. Now, ambient occlusion is not designed to be used for base color, it's designed to be used for the ambient occlusion. So we're going to disconnect that by holding Alt and left-clicking, and we're going to drag the RGB from the normal back to the normal. We're going to drag the RGB for the emissive color back to emissive color, and we'll drag the RGB for the base color back to base color to get those back. Now back to the T-Drone ORM, let's look at the green channel and mute the red channel. And this is different information packed into the green channel. This is the roughness channel. Notice the grayscale values. And this allows us to have the roughness vary across the surface of the mesh according to this texture. So let's give that a try by taking that green channel and hooking it on up. I'm going to click and drag and nudge my window up here to get to my roughness channel. Now check it out. Some parts are rough, some parts are less rough. The glass dome is very shiny because it's glass. And then the other parts are less rough according to the texture. Now, the last channel is the blue channel, which is the metallic channel. If we turn off the green and turn on the blue, here is what it looks like. We'll see that there are some parts that are supposed to be very metallic and others that should be less so. Let's hook up the blue channel into metallic. So I'm going to take the blue on this texture sample, click and drag and nudge my window on up to metallic. We'll hook that up. And now our material is complete. Now we have a material generated from our textures that were provided with this asset. And this is often the form that you'll see textures in. You'll have a base color texture, a emissive if there are any glowing parts on the mesh. We'll generally always have a normal map. And then ambient occlusion, roughness, and metallic are often packed into one single texture because those grayscale values can be packed into the red, green, and blue channels of a single texture. So that's just an optimization technique. Okay, so I'm going to right click on mDrone. I'll get a message that asks if I would like to apply the changes of the modified material of mDrone. I'm going to click yes. And now that I've right clicked on the tab, I'm going to close tabs to the right to get rid of all those textures. And now that we've applied, we didn't actually save it, but we applied it, we can go back to the basic map and see the material applied to the drones. And they look a lot better than they did before. Now, let's turn around and go back to these basic pieces of geometry for a second. And let's see what happens if we apply that drone material to these meshes. I'm going to take the mDrone, drag it into the world onto this cube here. And I'm going to drag it onto this sphere. And notice that these don't quite look right. I mean, sure, this kind of looks like a robot head, but really it doesn't look right. It's not a material that's designed for a sphere. It's not a material designed for a cube either. It was generated specifically for this mesh. So while some materials can be applied to various surfaces and they may look pretty good, other materials are generated specifically for a given mesh and are generally only used for that given mesh. So as you're making your games and getting assets from outside of the engine, somewhere on the internet, you'll generally be given these basic textures, and it's important to know how to use those textures when generating an Unreal Engine material asset. Now, as you saw in that clay brick material, these materials can get complex and you can do all sorts of things in them, but this is the basic set of skills that you need in general for getting your materials generated in the engine. And we'll get a little bit more complicated later in the course, but for now, we have our drone and its material, and it's looking great. So excellent job, and I'll see you in the next video.